Eevee and its evolutions are among the most popular Pokémon out there. It's not too strange to find people whose favorite Pokémon is one of these 9 fussy little guys. With that in mind, I thought it would be fun to assign one of these colorful Pokémon to the many rivals across the generations. And I figured, since a handful of rivals are also main characters, I might as well throw in all main characters for good measure. I don't want this to be entirely based on vibes, so there's going to be a few rules. The idea is to find an actual reason for the trainer to have that specific Eevee evolution, beyond just looks or personal preference. If a trainer has used an Eeveelution before in a main series game, then we will most likely default to that, and try to explain why it may or may not fit super well. I may reference side games and other media, but only as supplemental, not really having final say. Ultimately though, this is just for fun, and not meant to be super serious. So if you have suggestions or counter arguments, leave them in the comments below and start a civil conversation. Because there's so many Pokemon games out there, this will only be part 1 of 2, so if you're interested in the next part, be sure to subscribe. No better place to start than Generation 1. And there's a really easy one right off the bat with Red, Espeon. Although it would later be replaced with Lapras in the remakes, in the Gold, Silver, and Crystal versions of the big fight against Red, he has an Espeon in his team. A solid choice, if only because of the fact that Espeon is a Psychic type, a type commonly associated with extremely powerful Pokemon in the first few generations. Fitting for the most powerful trainer in all of Johto and Kanto. He even uses an Espeon on his Pokemon Stadium rematch, after having a Jolteon in the first round for some reason. Poor Pikachu. Next up is Leaf, and although she's heavily associated with Eevee in Pokemon Masters, with a name like that, I can't help but give her Leafeon. It may be from a generation after Leaf was already retired, but it just makes too much sense to me. Blue is a bit of a trickier one, as in Pokemon Yellow, he uses 3 different Eevee evolutions depending on how many times the player beats him in the early game, making it so he is heavily associated with all 3 Kanto Eeveelutions. We can't really go with the naming rule here like we did with Leaf, since his name in Japan is different, and it wouldn't make much sense. So instead, I propose we settle on Jolteon. Jolteon essentially represents Yellow's hard mode, because of the way the rival's Eevee evolves. Jolteon would, in theory, be the hardest one for the protagonist's Pikachu to defeat, since it resists electric attacks. Plus, there's something about short-tempered Jolteon and Blue's attitude during Gen 1 that fits rather well in my eyes. I considered going for Umbreon though, as Blue's anime counterpart, Gary, uses an Umbreon that became one of his most iconic Pokemon. Plus, it would go in line with Blue's starter choice, being stronger than Red's based on type matchups. It would make sense for him to evolve his Eevee in a way that would counter Red's Espeon. However, I think Jolteon still edges this one out for actually being used in one of Blue's teams. Chase and Elaine are too heavily associated with their partner Eevee for me to give them any evolution. It would sort of ruin the name of the game they're from, wouldn't it? As for Trace, well, I thought we'd have to use the same logic we did with Blue, but it turns out his Eevee can only evolve into Jolteon no matter what. Either way, he really is just tracing Blue's steps, huh? Generation 2 is up next, and things get a tad more complicated, since nobody is associated with any Eevee forms, but that won't stop me. Ethan is up first, and since Generation 2 introduced Dark types, I want to give him an Umbreon. A shiny one at that. Generation 2 introduced shiny Pokemon, and I wouldn't be surprised if Ethan had gone back to shiny hunt for an Eevee, and later evolved it into a tanky Umbreon, capable of standing up to Red. Even if we ignore the type advantage against Espeon, Red's battle is brutal, with hail and lots of blizzards to endure. It would stand to reason that Ethan may train a tanky Umbreon capable of standing through all that damage. With Chris being introduced in Crystal version, it would make sense for her to have a Vaporeon. Despite having a Jolteon in Pokemon Masters, it simply makes sense to me that the character chosen by Suicune would train the Water-type Eevee evolution, commonly thought by fans to have been the Pokemon that perished in the Burn Tower before becoming Suicune. Lyra is a bit more difficult for me. In Pokemon Masters, she was given a Vaporeon, and that's the only case I can think of in which she had an Eevee evolution. I guess it would pair up okay with the Marill she's associated with as an NPC, rather than as a main character, but I'm a little stumped to be honest. Perhaps I could go with an Espeon. Not only because it was introduced in Generation 2, but also because it evolves through mechanics introduced in Johto, happiness, and the day and night cycle, which further strengthens Ethan's Umbreon too in my opinion. Perhaps they could both be eggs given to them, involving yet another Generation 2 mechanic. Silver feels like an Umbreon shoe-in. The brand new Dark type, heavily associated with evil teams and the like. You could argue the issue is that he'd need to increase the Eevee's friendship or happiness to evolve it, but I'd say that's all the more reason, since that didn't stop his Crobat from evolving. It'd be a nice way to show his growth as a person by the end of the game too, as he learns to care for his Pokémon. Generation 3 was extremely hard. There are no Eevee native to the Hoenn region after all. I think a Vaporeon would really help traverse this water-heavy region though, surfing, diving, and climbing waterfalls. Even if it feels like a bit of a cheap pick, I think it fits Brendan and May pretty well. As for Wally, I'd give him a Leafeon. Not only are his signature Pokemon already very plant-like, but it also feels fitting with him moving to Petalburg to heal from his sickness thanks to the clean air. Sinnoh brings with it some complications. Lucas appears as an NPC for the player to fight in Brilliant Diamond and Shining Pearl, and some of his teams include Eeveelutions. But these depend entirely on the player starter. Let's see. I guess we could narrow it down between these three. In Pokémon Masters, he uses a Flareon. But then again, Glaceon was introduced in Generation 4 and for some time could only be obtained near Snowpoint City, by one of Sinnoh's 3 lakes that are heavily tied to those games' stories. For that, I'm leaning towards Glaceon personally. When it comes to Dawn, we may need to use the name rule again, like we did with Leaf, and give her an Espeon. She's never used an Eevee before in any appearances, but with a name like Dawn, I can't help but give her the Sun Pokemon. Her Japanese name Hikari is also heavily associated with light. Barry's another tough one. Although his blonde hair and short fuse initially made me want to go for Jolteon, with him wanting so desperately to be Crasher Wake's apprentice, I was also leaning towards Vaporeon. Ultimately, I think Jolteon fits a bit better, since Crasher Wake never acknowledged himself as his mentor, but I could see him trying to evolve his Eevee into a water type just to twist his hand, without it really working out. Ray and Akari are technically rivals and main characters too, but locking in specific evolutions for them is quite tough as well. I suppose with them being tasked with exploring and surveying the Hisui region before it was named Sinnoh, it'd make sense for their Eevee to evolve into Leafeon and Glaceon by accidentally interacting with the mossy and ice rocks. I think they could be assigned interchangeably, but simply going off of Lucas having a Glaceon, I'd give that to Ray and Leafeon to Akari. Like Hoenn, Unova is another region with an Eevee scarcity. Hilbert and Hilda both have Eevee evolutions in Pokémon Masters, but outside of that, it's quite hard to pin down one Eevee for each of them. We could go over it in a variety of different ways, but I think the way I'll go around it is this way. Black and White are all about demonstrating the bond between people and Pokémon to end. Therefore, I think Umbreon and Espeon would fit rather well thematically. Since Hilbert is usually associated with Black and Hilda with White, we'll give him Umbreon and her Espeon, but the opposite could also work. Bianca feels like she would have a Flareon. It's fluffy and cute, even if it's not particularly great in battle, just as she is. In all seriousness, it feels like it would fit right in with the rest of her Pokemon, and her theme of finding herself as a Pokemon researcher rather than as an active battler. While Charon might be a bit of a cop-out, but as a normal-type gym leader, I'd be more than willing to give him an Eevee, perhaps one that can Gigantamax or reach the heights of the powerful partner Eevee from Let's Go. If it were to evolve into anything, I may go with the powerful Sylveon, mixing in strong normal-type moves with the ability Pixelate, but Eevee suits the guy with a Lillipup much better, I think. and uses both Glaceon and Leafeon in 2 different teams in Black 2 and White 2 that don't depend on the player's starter choice or anything like that, so Game Freak basically already did our homework for us. To narrow it down to just one option though, I'd go with Leafeon. Not only does the green match N's hair, but his name being natural feels like a good fit. Yes, I know it stands for natural numbers, as he always talks about formulas, but still, Leafeon gives me that natural harmony vibe. Rosa and Nate are protagonists tasked with saving Unova from Team Plasma's misuse of Kyurem. I think it would be kind of funny if we gave them both Glaceon to go in line with all the ice the games are themed after thanks to Kyurem. Although, I suppose Flareon as a means to counter and melt the ice may be an even better fit. I know I just threw some shade at Flareon a few minutes ago, so I guess to make up for that, we can give Flareon the important task of fighting off a legendary Pokemon's ice. Thematically, melting the ice would also help bring people together despite their different ideals, so I actually quite like that choice. Finally, Hugh, an extremely hot-headed and easy to set off trainer, always in a rush to enact justice, and with spiky hair to boot. I think this one's yet another Jolteon. And here's everyone so far. These are quite a lot of characters, which is why I'm dividing this into 2 parts. If you found this fun, then part 2 will cover the remaining rivals and main characters from Gen 6 onwards. So make sure to subscribe and stay tuned until then. See ya!